So we are here together because of the Collections as Data Part to Whole grant, with funds from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation re-granted through the University of Nevada, with funds from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. LSU Libraries and the Louisiana Digital Library are part of a cohort charged with creating examples of how to operationalize the use of digital cultural heritage materials as data. We are thrilled to be part of this cohort. If you haven't had a chance yet to familiarize yourself with all the other great projects involved, I encourage you to do so at your convenience. Our part of the Collections as Data Part to Whole project is investigating what it would mean to make the entirety of the Louisiana Digital Library available as data. For context, the LDL is Louisiana's statewide digital repository for cultural heritage material, with over 30 participating institutions, including public libraries, academic libraries, archives, and museums. We know that our project of this scale and complexity will include both a technical angle in which we build out APIs and enable bulk downloads, among many other things, and there was a lot of work to do in this arena. But more central to our project to date is the community work that all of this entails. Because we're thinking about what we can get out of the LDL in terms of data to use and reuse in various forms, we also need to think very carefully about what goes into the LDL. Doing so invites questions about digitization selection, conscientious metadata remediation, as well as evaluations of what collections should not, in fact, be widely shared, because we know not everything should be treated the same way. And it's because of these questions and many others that we launched the speaker series so that we can all learn together. And because we know the LDL is not alone in this journey, we're so happy to see such a great turnout from beyond our state. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to take a moment to invite you to attend our full speaker series. Using the URL on the screen, you can find recordings to all the speaker series guests we've had so far, as well as the growing and evolving schedule of upcoming events. We are, as you all know, still in the midst of a pandemic, so not all the details are yet finalized for the talks coming up next semester. But we have every reason to believe that they will be amazing, because they all, in fact, have been amazing. And as you can see from the names on the screen, we are exactly halfway through our speaker series, and we have learned so much. So please register for these upcoming talks, watch and rewatch all your favorites through the recordings, and please share with friends and colleagues. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jessica Perkins Smith. Jessica is University Archivist and Assistant Professor at Mississippi State University. Previously, she was a project archivist at the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans. Jessica holds a bachelor's degree in history from Millsaps College and a master's of library and information science from Louisiana State University. I am particularly excited about Jessica's talk and how it fits within the larger speaker series. We have recently heard Dorothy Berry on the topic of centering marginalized communities in digital collections, as well as Tanya Sutherland on emerging trends in digital collections to promote appropriate context and responsible description. Jessica's talk will add a valuable use case, I believe. And in addition, I'm always happy to welcome another Southern archivist engaged in this valuable work. Jessica, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you're welcome to start sharing yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I want to first thank SL and Leah and Gina and all of the LDL as data team for inviting me to do this today. I'm really excited. As SL said, I'm Jessica Perkins Smith, and I'm the University Archivist at Mississippi State in Starkville. And today I'm going to address some of the complexities around selection for digitization in a place like Mississippi, and the need to balance transparency about our state's white supremacist, segregationist past, but also to ensure that diverse voices that push back against years of entrenched racism are heard. I'm going to specifically address two collections today, the Citizens Council Radio Forum and the first African American student group at Mississippi State, Afro American Plus. And also, I have to say that this talk is really a chance to give me, it's giving me a chance to talk about two of my favorite collections that I've worked on here at Mississippi State. So I'm excited about that. Okay, so first, a little bit of background on the history of digitization at Mississippi State. The first digitization was done here probably close to 10 years ago. It may be a little bit longer than that. It was before I got here, close to 5 years ago. And it was done thanks to a pretty large grant. And several notable collections of mostly Mississippi history were digitized at that time, including the Charles Templeton Senior Music Collection, photographs reflecting Mississippi politics from the Congressional and Political Research Center, and material from agricultural collections for the CHARM project. And CHARM is the Consortium for the History of Agricultural and Rural Life in Mississippi. And included in the CHARM project were the scanning of images, correspondence, and reports from the Mississippi Cooperative Extension Service, which documents both white and Black extension and home demonstration work during the time that extension was segregated. Extension is part of Mississippi's land grant mission and serves Mississippi State's land grant mission and serves all 82 counties in the state. These early digitization efforts of Mississippi agricultural collections made a concerted effort to include representation of Black Mississippians. After this initial grant project, the Digital Preservation and Access Unit at Mississippi State was formalized and now works closely with special collections faculty, with us and special collections faculty to make digitization decisions and to set priorities. We now meet monthly to discuss our ongoing projects and new proposals and to try to be intentional about our decision making for digitization. These images that you see here are two of the images that were digitized in this first grant with the CHARM project. Alice Little was a Black home demonstration agent who, as you can see, served for over 29 years. This brochure is honoring her, and she was from Lee County, from Tupelo, Mississippi. And this is just an image kind of typical of what you might see from home demonstration. While they were segregated, there are often images of white home demonstration agents and Black home demonstration agents working together, although most of their presentations that they would have done in communities would have been totally segregated. So the question for us as archivists then is, how do we document and contextualize this complex history in a way that is both representative but without whitewashing a racially violent past? Especially when that past is not actually in the past and still lives with us in debates over the state flag. We recently had a senator who won re-election after joking about public hangings in the state with the highest number of lynchings on record. And monuments to the Confederacy and segregation surround us. And administrators and donors at another state institution have openly lamented about Black students ruining their town and square. So Mississippi is fraught. Telling stories of white supremacy in Mississippi doesn't make you popular, and digitization can open cans of worms that can't be closed again. So in thinking about digitizing white supremacy here in the state, but also thinking about the Black student experience at a white Southern institution, I've thought a lot about, Alex Poole wrote a great article in the American Archivist in 2014, The Strange Career of Jim Crow Archives, in which Poole argues that the history of Jim Crow archives bequeaths a fourfold legacy. First, archives is never a neutral space. First, archivists and related professionals possess agency. The archives is not a neutral space. Indeed, the archivist is, in subtle ways, tends to perpetuate the political and economic status quo simply by going about his ordinary business. Second, the mission of professional archivists centers on providing access to sources and serving users. During the middle years of the 20th century, archivists struggled to balance the professional article of faith with their personal and community mores concerning race. African American scholars received lesser degrees of access and lesser forms of service. Third, archivists must be held accountable in their records collection and records management practices. Accountability depends upon promoting diversity in the archival profession and advocating for the collection and retention of records diverse in form and content. And finally, archivists and associated professionals influence the writing of history as much now as in the 1950s, is Poole's argument. So despite this past and present, Mississippi finally has a new flag, and it is our duty as archivists in the state to ensure access to the history of the state, fraught and controversial as it is. Recent digitization projects also done at Howard and the University of Maryland and the HBCU Library Alliance and Cornell Library Digitization Initiative are excellent examples of the work being done to digitize Black student experiences. So that's kind of the work I've been thinking about and thinking about digitizing Black student experience at Mississippi State. So Mississippi State Digital Collections, and this is just a couple of snapshots of our collections and our pages and the way that they're organized. And currently, these are all of our collections that are in Content DM. We did recently get a site license for Omeka for the university library. So we have just started creating exhibits in Omeka, and the new Afro American Plus exhibit that I've created is in Omeka. Most of what we've done in the past has been in Content DM, which has its pluses and minuses. So they're very different to work with. So in addition to these difficult questions, in terms of pedagogy and research, we as archivists have to think about what collections will be most useful to our researchers, both our own students and faculty, but also researchers using our digital collections from afar. So a quick pandemic side note, the importance of the need to have smaller, more accessible digital collections has never been more evident to us in special collections until the pandemic hit in March. We spent much of our spring and summer quickly scanning collections and sometimes just access copies of collections particularly for the history methods class that we work with every semester, but for some other courses as well, because we discovered that it's a lot easier for, while some of our digital collections, some professors have told us, are great for teaching, but when they're combined, like just selected items from other collections, it's more difficult to write a paper. So we have really tried to be diligent about digitizing entire collections now. And so that's one of the things we've really worked towards the past few months, especially during the pandemic, because everything we've been doing teaching-wise has been digital. So I'm going to switch gears and kind of just delve right into Mississippi and the Citizens Council. And I think that in understanding kind of Mississippi and the civil rights movement, I have a really strong belief that you have to understand the Citizens Council and the white supremacy of Mississippi in order to really understand the powerful role of the council in fighting integration, the sway that it held throughout the state throughout much of the 20th century. So the first White Citizens Council was formed on July 11th, 1954 in Indianola, Mississippi in the Mississippi Delta. The first meeting, about 14 of the town's civic leaders, so these would be business owners, teachers, lawyers, members of city government, met to form the first council, and then about a week later had 100 citizens to formally organize and elect officers. Heading up this organizing was Robert Tut Patterson, who was a former Mississippi State football star and a farmer from Indianola. And Patterson really felt like he was answering Circuit Court Judge and Segregationist Tom P. Brady's May 1954 speech, Black Monday. Brady spoke before the Greenwood Sons of the American Revolution in directly answering the Brown v. Board decision of May 1954. So Brady, his address was called Black Monday, Segregation and Amalgamation. He called on white Southerners to fight for states' rights and to maintain segregation or risk the loss of their way of life. His diatribe was in response to the Brown decision, which of course said that segregation was inherently unequal and that integration should occur with all deliberate speed. Over the next 10 years, the council grew in power and strength throughout the state and throughout the Southeast and eventually other parts of the United States, but they were especially powerful in Mississippi. They used intimidation and quietly and sometimes not so quietly endorsed violence in order to maintain school segregation and what they referred to as racial integrity. The council had an ongoing public relations campaign, including a newsletter, The Citizen, and a national radio show, Forum, which ran from 1957 to 1966 and included interviews with segregationists like Strom Thurmond, George Wallace, Jim Eastland, but also lesser-known council organizers like Sarah McCorkle, who was a Greenville mother and wife. She ran all the council's educational efforts, including essay contests with titles like Why I Believe in Separation of the Races. First, the Forum radio show was first recorded in Mississippi and then later moved and got office space actually on Capitol Hill. They realized that this could give them more sway nationally they could get more prominent politicians and reach a broader audience. So Forum became the council's largest investment. They had money coming in from private donors, from state governments and the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. And it's really evidence of how organized resistance permeated Southern politics. I'm not sure if this is entirely true or if I believe it, but in some of the Citizens Council records we have, they claim that at one time Forum was broadcast to over 1,000 radio stations throughout the United States. We know that it probably went out pretty broadly, but they were also prone to exaggeration. So these are just some of the kind of well-known segregationist names that were on the show, and by on the show I mean dozens and dozens of times. I think Strom Thurmond was recorded over 40 times. John Stennis the same, probably 20 or 30 times. And Bill Simmons was a longtime director of the Citizens Council until they folded in the 1980s. So I'm going to attempt to play a piece of audio, and I don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to try it. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. If it doesn't work, I'll give you guys the link and you can listen to it later. I will say that the beginning of every Forum show did start with Dixie, so you are going to hear that. So I just want to put that warning out there. You hear it?
This is the Citizens Council Forum, the American viewpoint with a Southern accent, presented by the Citizens Councils of America on behalf of affiliated state organizations throughout the South. The Citizens Councils are dedicated to states' rights and racial integrity, to individual liberty, and to race relations based on common sense, not on the power politics of left-wing pressure groups. The Citizens Councils are primarily a means of mobilizing public opinion. Informed people will not surrender their freedom. Now, from Washington, here is your host for Citizens Council Forum, Dick Morphew.
Okay, I wanted to give you guys an idea of what the show sounds like, and also that was an episode from 1961 with Senator Jim Eastland, and actually in 1957 when the show started, the introduction was a little less forceful. It was more about they just say the show, the Citizens Council in the Southern, with a Southern bent. And by 1961, they're specifically talking about race in their introduction. So I just want to give you an idea of what it sounds like and kind of where their thought process was. So the way the grant for this collection came about was kind of really a happy accident that sort of all came together in 2016, in 2017, not long after I came to Mississippi State. When I got here, the Citizens Council and white supremacy and civil rights in Mississippi had always been at the center of my research interests. So I learned pretty quickly that our special collections has a wealth of collections in those areas. And so I was spending a lot of time learning those collections, both so I could learn the collections to assist researchers, but also so that I could, also for my own promotion and tenure. So while I was still working on learning the collections, I had a couple of different researchers request transcripts of the Citizens Council Forum. And they said, we know that you all have the transcripts. Can we see them? And I didn't know we had the transcripts. So I did a little digging and talking to my colleagues and learned that we did. And so I was able to share those. But it seems like it was sort of on a need to know basis. So certain folks knew that we had them. They were not on our website. So in doing a little more digging, I discovered that not only we did have the transcripts, but we also had all 400 of the Citizens Council Forum reel-to-reel tapes. And I learned from colleagues and from doing some digging in the transcripts themselves that the transcripts had been donated and transcribed and donated to special collections by Stephanie Rolfe, who now is a Millsaps College history professor and was a PhD student at Mississippi State years ago. And so her dissertation was on the Citizens Council, and she used the forum tapes and transcribed all 400 of them. And so at the end, she donated them because she was so thankful to the archivists here that supported her and helped her with that work. So I actually know Stephanie because I went to Millsaps, and so I was able to talk to her about it. And in this discovery phase, I also learned that not only do we have a complete run of the tapes, but it looks like we have the only complete run that exists. And that's based on just a lot of searching, and also the Library of Congress lists us as being the only one. So we haven't ever been able to figure out if that's totally true or not, but we have never found anyone else that has a complete run of these. Around this time, CLIR, the Council on Library and Information Resources, announced a pilot call for their first Recordings at Risk grant to digitize at-risk video or audio, and the digitization for the pilot would be done by the Northeast Document Conservation Center in New England. Which, if any of you know of the work that they do, they're really pioneering in terms of preservation of audio, of video. First, it was paper, but they're just the best of the best. So I was really excited about this grant possibility, and I spoke to Stephanie, and she told me that when the archivist would put the tapes on the reels on the projector years before, they were already starting to snap. Some of them were, and the sound quality wasn't great. So we knew that we probably had a limited time with these tapes. So with letters of support from Dr. Rolfe and from other researchers who'd worked on these collections and support from my department administration, I applied and the grant was successful. So it was one of 8 projects, pilot projects that was fully funded in 2017. So we got $25,000, which allowed us to digitize 270 of the tapes. And so that itself involved the selection process, right? So the selection process that I decided on was to prioritize Mississippi politicians, Citizens Council leaders, and then national politicians. And that really allowed us to get kind of the most interesting, some of them are not controversial and some of them are not interesting, but the most well-known names and the topics that we thought that our researchers would be most interested in. So working with the NEDCC was fantastic. It was really a privilege. They so much of the metadata on the technical end was already done for me by the time the tapes came back. And while it did require some wrangling on my end to get it ready for our digital unit, they just really made things so much easier. And if you've worked on digital projects, you know that the metadata can be most of the battle. So our end result is a digital collection that went live in spring of 2019 in Content DM. And this is just the homepage of the collection. And it's searchable by subject, by interviewee, and then each of Stephanie's transcript is also attached with the audio. And her transcripts are partial, but they're pretty good. And so that's been like really useful for researchers to already have that. You know, you don't even have to do the transcription yourself. We were lucky enough to get a fair amount of press coverage. Our Office of Public Affairs here sent out the press release that went out pretty widely. And so we got some national, a good bit of local coverage, but some national coverage as well. So this is some of the press that we got from that collection. So talking about that, I want to move to just putting Mississippi State now in context of Mississippi and in context of segregation and of white supremacy prior to integration. So Mississippi State was founded as Mississippi Agricultural and Mechanical College in 1878 as a public land grant institution established thanks to the Morrill Act of 1862, which established national land grant entities with the mission to provide training in agriculture, horticulture, and the mechanical arts. Officially opened in 1880, the first president of Mississippi A&M was Confederate Civil War General Stephen D. Lee. And Mississippi A&M was established in Starkville in the northeastern part of the state, and that was largely due to access to the railroad. So one of the things that that's obvious to most folks, I guess, in archives, but is that even though we were a segregated campus until 1965, there were African Americans on campus. And so in some of my research and digging around and doing exhibits on Black history here at Mississippi State, these are a couple of the people worked in the service industry on campus, in custodial, maintenance, laundry, and food service roles. And in the early years of Mississippi A&M, there was a handyman on campus. This postcard shows him, named Elder George, and who is actually considered a mascot at the time by most folks here at Mississippi A&M. When he was eulogized, when he died in the early 1900s, the newspaper The Reflector eulogized him by saying, "The wrinkled visage and cryptic philosophy of this colored patriarch was familiar to every A&M man from General Stephen D. Lee, the founder of the college, to the lowliest freshman. He was one of the greatest A&M traditions, and famous men over the country will read of his death with a throb of sorrow in their hearts." So this is Elder George. And in the early vertical files here at Mississippi State, he was actually listed in the mascot file. So we've since put him in. We have a Pioneers of African American History at Mississippi State vertical file, and that's where the coverage is now. But he was very much considered a mascot in the early 1900s. And then this is Walter Kilbourne, who is another African American who worked for many, many years on campus, but his nickname was Uncle Remus. So I say all of this to put this kind of in context of segregation at Mississippi State and at a Southern institution and what it is like dealing with those kinds of materials. So Mississippi State was segregated until 1965, when Richard Holmes, who is a Starkville native and a student at Wiley College, which was a historically Black college in Texas, Holmes enrolled quietly in summer school here in the summer of '65. Unlike earlier integrations of institutions like Ole Miss, Alabama, and the University of Georgia, Holmes's integration was without violent resistance. The day in July of '65 that he enrolled, Holmes told the press that he was not there to make news and he only wanted to get a good education with no impediments. He would later write and say that his time at Mississippi State, while he appreciated his education deeply, that his time here was lonely and he often felt isolated. He has talked in interviews about having friends in class, white students who were lab partners, who he worked closely with because he took biology and chemistry classes, but who could not socialize with him outside of class. He also has talked about being friendly with custodial staff that worked in the YMCA building where his room was. Holmes went on to get a medical degree at Michigan State, and in 1991, the University Multicultural Center here on campus was renamed the Holmes Cultural Diversity Center in his honor. And in 2003, Dr. Holmes actually came back to Mississippi State to serve as a doctor at the health center on campus. Today, Mississippi State has the largest African American student population in the Southeastern Conference at about 19%. And one of the highest outside of historically Black colleges and universities in the US. While Dr. Holmes' story is well known here on campus, I found in kind of doing some of this research a few years ago that there was little history out there about other Black students on campus. The other story that is well known and is told is one of our digital collections, is that of the Game of Change. So in 1963, despite an unwritten rule that Southeastern Conference teams would not play teams with Black players, this was like a long unwritten rule in the SEC, Mississippi State University President Dean Colvard and basketball coach Babe McCarthy defied the segregationist governor Ross Barnett's order and snuck the MSU Maroons out of the state to play an integrated Loyola Chicago team in the first round of the NCAA basketball tournament. Colvard is written in his diary. He was not a Mississippian, and we have his diary here. And he also was president a couple years later when Richard Holmes integrated. And Colvard wrote about the pressure on the basketball team to be able to play. They were really good and they had qualified before and had not gone. There's a really great NPR short piece that was done a few years ago, and I'll share the link to that, but I don't want to go to play that right now. But that interviews players, Loyola Chicago and Mississippi State players from that game. Mississippi State did lose, but they did play, and this is a photo after the game, after Loyola won. And this is actually, this game has like lived in the lore here at Mississippi State, and it actually is continuing to generate interest. There's a filmmaker who's been working on a film who's from New York and who's been corresponding back and forth with me for months, working on pictures and correspondence. So this game continues to have a lot of stories around it and a lot of interest. We do have a digital collection related to the Game of Change, but this is one of those that was done several years ago. And it's one of those things where digitizing decisions were made. And one of the decisions that was made at the time several years ago was that only letters written to President Colvard that approved his sending the team to play Loyola Chicago would be put on the digital collection. So this is one of those things where, you know, archivists have a lot of power, but also Mississippi is very fraught. And so there were names in those letters of disapproval, and we have dozens and dozens of those names. I've shared one of the telegrams right here, and I don't know if you guys can read it, but one of the things that says is, white Caucasian people, you have been doing a pretty good job at MSU. Now don't lose our confidence in you by not standing up for principle and our way of life. So that our way of life is always kind of harken back to in terms of this segregationist thought. So currently we don't have these letters of disapproval on our website in that digital collection. That was a decision that was made several years ago. And I've kind of gone back and forth about including those letters in the future. I say all of this to say that because of my own research on Black history on campus, and because I felt like that there are holes not only in our own collections, because there was not always a concerted effort to collect the material of Black students and Black student groups, but there's also holes in the stories that students learn about Black history on campus. So 2 years ago, I proposed and developed a first-year experience FYE course on African American student life here at Mississippi State. In this course, students learn about the founding of the university during segregation. We talk about what integration looked like here. We talk a lot about Richard Holmes. There are interviews with him. We have folks from the Holmes Center come and speak to class. Come and speak to the class about the history of diversity here at Mississippi State. We talk about the Game of Change. But usually I'm able to bring students into special collections to do primary source research. That's kind of the goal of the class, is for them to learn about Black student life here on campus, for them to maybe find out things that we didn't know about, and to dig into the primary sources. This year, that involved a lot of scanning and digitization on my part, which is how I came to decide to digitize the Afro American Plus collection, because I realized it's really rich and there's a lot of great material there. And it'd be a lot more accessible to students and researchers if, instead of just scanning material and putting in a Google Drive for my class, if I digitize it for everybody to use. So Afro American Plus. So this student organization was founded in 1968 when there were roughly less than 100 Black students here on campus, just a couple of years after Richard Holmes integrated the university. And they, as their constitution says here, they were founded with several goals in mind. Their goals were to become better recognized as students of Mississippi State, to promote a peaceful coexistence with other students, and to educate all about Black culture and instill Black pride. What I found most interesting about their papers and about the collection is that they were not just a student organization or a club. These students were very much activists and aware of their place in history. They were aware of kind of the dynamic with white students on campus, with their inability to maybe hang out at other places on campus and other places in town. They talk a lot about that in some of the documentation that we have. So this was a place for Black students to find belonging and socialization, but also they really pushed for change. They were in existence for about 17 years on campus before several different groups formed out of that one group. So their goal really was to make life better for Black students on campus, and they worked to that end. So some of the things that Afro-American Plus did, and these are some of the items that have been digitized so far. They had lots of events and programming. They had a scholarship program, a Miss African American Plus pageant, and they petitioned for a long time before they finally were able to become part of the Miss Mississippi State pageant and not have their own segregated pageant. Black Voices is one of the oldest organizations Black organizations on campus, is a chorus, a choir, and so they had concerts. They hosted many famous African American speakers. This Afro Times newsletter, which is really more of a newspaper. I've digitized a couple of copies of that already that are available on our website. But they cover campus news and national news and state news and athletics, but all from a Black student perspective. There's often poems and cartoons that kind of depict Black student life at Mississippi State. And this was a short run, but we probably have about 8 or 9 issues of it. And then they also did very regularly every year Black History Week and Black History Month programming. So I mentioned speakers, and off the bat, their very first speaker in 1968 was Fannie Lou Hamer, who was invited to campus. And this is coverage from the Starkville Daily News about Hamer's visit to campus, which was not without controversy. So many of their speakers, there were times where administration pushed back on having these speakers on campus. Other speakers that they invited included Stokely Carmichael, that was especially controversial, Aaron Henry, and NAACP President Roy Wilkins. So I mentioned this kind of push for change, and really where I've discovered this more is we have this Afro-American Plus collection of their papers, which was donated years ago to special collections. But in working on digitizing this stuff, I also found that their correspondence shows up in our presidential papers. So President Giles and President McComas, who were presidents in the late 60s, 70s, and early 1980s. And these students were constantly writing to McComas and Giles. They invited them to every single event they ever had. And then they also were constantly writing letters and laying out, these are the issues that need to be addressed for Black students on campus. And so their main goals were to recruit more Black students to Mississippi State, to recruit Black professors. They were actually successful in obtaining a Black counselor for African American students on campus. And they pushed for regular meetings with campus administration over the needs of Black students. So things like the need for a hairdresser to style and cut Black hair. My students this past year were particularly interested in that. And as well as push back on housing and financial aid discrimination. In a 1974 synopsis on the needs of Black students at Mississippi State, this was sent to President Giles, and the president of Afro-American Plus at the time, Michael Booker, writes, although approximately 10% of the university's student body is Black, the university has not deemed it necessary to employ the services of Black individuals in high echelon positions who may serve as role modelers for the Black student body. In addition, Booker argued that the university actively resisted endorsing Black culture, from the lack of Black entertainers invited to campus to the resistance of the university to establishing a Black fraternity on campus. And what I think is especially notable about these requests is that they're not one-time requests, or this was a 7-page synopsis that was sent to President Giles. These same requests show up again and again and again in 1972, in 1974, in 79, in 81, and 84. So they weren't always addressed. There is a good deal of correspondence from white administrators, all retired now. Many of them have passed away, but some of them are still alive. So that is also fraught, right? This decision of, do we digitize that material or not? When I first decided to work on this collection, I figured we would digitize these articles and the papers of this group, but it has kind of turned into a much bigger project. I have a shell of an Omeka exhibit up now that's available for folks to see, but I'm still making decisions about digitizing correspondence to the presidents and working on some oral histories, because a lot of these students are still alive. And I was able to, in working with the Holmes Center and the Black Alumni Association, I've gotten a list of students. So that's my next goal, is to work on some oral histories of some of these students. So this is sort of the shell of the beginning of the exhibit. There are several items in it already. And again, this is an Omeka, so it's a little bit different from Content DM, a little cleaner looking, probably a little more easily searchable for our students and for researchers, is kind of my hope. But this kind of harkens back to my discussion at the beginning about making decisions about digitization for student researchers. And while we want to make things available for everyone at this point, most of our teaching is online, and we don't have the space in our reading room to bring in classes right now to do it safely. So we want to be able to offer as many collections as possible and diverse voices as possible to students for their own research. So again, these decisions of what to digitize for this collection are difficult, just like the decisions for what to digitize for the Citizens Council, because Mississippi is complicated and it is fraught. And one thing that I've learned, and my family's from Mississippi, although I didn't grow up here, but my family's from Mississippi, and everybody knows everybody. And so if I publish these letters, someone will know someone in those letters. So there's a lot of thinking of wrestling with those decisions. And those are difficult decisions for archivists, because we have to decide, we have a lot of power. And I think back to the article that I talked about at the beginning in the Jim Crow archives, because what we leave out is then a story that is not told and not developed for and available for students and for researchers. But digitization is complicated, right? Because there's a big difference between someone coming into our reading room and looking at these materials and actually putting them out there for the world to see. But so my goal is to have to continue to digitize material for Afro-American Plus, and to get some oral histories and actually get some voices of these Black students out there and include those in this exhibit. So that is all I have for today. These are some of my sources.
Fantastic, Jessica. Thank you so much. If you'd be willing, I'm going to go ahead and stop your screen share. That way we can all see each other a little bit better. But yes, I wanted to just sort of jump in before the questions. Just as thank you again for doing this and for giving this talk. I'm delighted at how well it fits in, and how the themes that you touch on are prominent within the speaker series, and for you to give it this very sort of practitioner concretized state, both descriptions of people and digitization selections. I'm also going to, since everyone has to listen to me right now, I'm going to go ahead and do the first question, if you don't mind. You mentioned before a couple of different ways, but at one point that talking about white supremacy in Mississippi doesn't necessarily make you very popular. Can you talk to whatever degree you feel comfortable about any pushback that you've gotten for these projects?
Yeah. I think there was concern early on about once the grant had already been done and we had the metadata, and the collection actually was already published, and just it hadn't been publicized and nobody really knew about it. There was some concern about the names of the folks that would show up in these Citizens Council tapes. And my argument there was that these were politicians, and even the folks that were involved in the Citizens Council that weren't politicians were politically active, and they were segregationists, and their names were out there, and they were speaking on this stuff. And so if their family, had a complaint later on, I mean, they were on the public record. These were radio shows. So that was my argument there. I think in a question of things like these letters to President Colvard arguing against the university sending the team to play Black players, I understand why that decision was made 10 or 12 years ago when that collection was put up. A lot of those folks are still alive. I don't want to be in the position of protecting racists or segregationists, but I think that is an issue, especially in a state like this, where so many people have this kind of history in their past, in their family's past. One of my colleagues, Fred Smith, who's our rare books curator, we talk about this stuff all the time because we know that there's a lot of Citizens Council material that just disappeared, just got thrown away because people either the offices got cleaned out and we don't know what happened to that material, or people find it in their parents' attic or their grandparents' attic and they throw it away, right? They don't want people to know about that past. So that is a complicated issue. But once we publicized the collection, we did not get any negative anything. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised. All of the, no trolling comments or anything like that. So that was a positive experience. Yeah. I see. Can I answer that one that I see in the chat?
Yeah, we've got a question from Miriam, who asks, do you ever hear from alumni, faculty, or administrators from the era, and do they have opinions on the archives?
I do, actually, and I have not had those kind of conversations, but there are a couple of retired administrators who were actually, one of them, his name shows up not in writing any of those letters, but he was an administrator when Afro American Plus was active. And we actually have a really good working relationship because he donates material. So he's the kind of person I could ask. I just haven't yet. I actually recently just saw his name in some of these letters. So, and he probably wouldn't have a problem with it. And there might be some other administrators or their families that would have a problem. But there are folks that I can ask that are still around and still, active in the community. Yeah.
So the next one was, were the letters of disapproval about the game digitized, but not published on the website, or not digitized at all?
That I'm not 100% sure on. If they probably were digitized, and I just haven't found them because there is, now I've scanned a lot of them myself, but there are, our digital staging area is kind of huge and there's a lot of stuff there. So I'm not sure if those were digitized initially and just not put up. But I've since digitized a lot of them and used them in my class.
Okay. Looks like Stanley would like to ask a brief question. I don't know if we can unmute him or if you can write that in the chat. While we think about that, I had a question. You mentioned moving Elder George out of the mascot file, and then also another man who is nicknamed Uncle Remus. So obviously some of these like problematic cataloging and description was coming up. And the last talk we had from Dr. Sutherland was about redescription. So did these projects offer an opportunity for some remediation and redescription? Was wondering if you could talk some about that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And that's not something that we've done yet. But I think in terms of those particular items, they're just in a vertical file, in University Archives vertical file. They haven't been scanned or digitized. And I think that if we did that, there would definitely be some opportunity for redescription. I know that some of the photos, some of the African American extension photos were labeled in certain ways, the ones that were scanned a long time ago. And one of my colleagues recently sent me one that was a University Archives photo, and it just said something about Negro woman on the back. And so that is something that I thought, okay, that's probably metadata that we need to fix and do some redescription, because that is a photo that's actually on our website that was put in a long time ago. So I think those are definitely good questions. I have not done that yet, but it's something that definitely got me thinking after the last talk. Yeah.
Stanley, if you want to jump in.
Sure, Jessica, what an impressive presentation and materials. I wonder whether you all are collecting, still collecting white supremacist material, contemporary even.
That's a good question. We occasionally will get some. Actually, there's another project I'm working on of a guy who was involved in a cooperative farm here in Mississippi, who was kicked out of the state by the Citizens Council, and he collected white supremacist stuff. And so a lot of our Citizens Council material is from Alan Cox. In Alan Cox's papers, I found that a grad student who is still alive, who is later got his PhD in history and teaches, he was the one that got Cox to donate all this material. So I've since talked to this grad student who's now a retired history professor, and he sent me some not too long ago, right before at the beginning of the pandemic, he sent some Klan material that he had collected years ago when he was a grad student in the 60s. He worked for the Associated Press and followed Klan rallies. So he collected material and sent it. We don't actively pursue it. I know that in some notes of our previous manuscript archivist who retired a while ago, she was trying to get Tut Patterson's papers. Tut Patterson of the Citizens Council, he died a few years ago. We don't know what happened with that. And that is kind of one of those things where I'm sure that died because you don't necessarily want to be seen going after that material. How do you publicize it? Especially if it's coming directly from the person, that white supremacist. So we don't actively go after it. We still do get it donated to us sometimes, yes.
And then we had a question from Gina. Have you collaborated with the Mississippi State Office of Diversity, and is your FYE course a part of the diversity certificate program? What other campus partnerships do you have that help get the word out about collecting materials and highlighting the ones that you have currently?
So I have worked with the Holmes Center in my class. It's not a formal partnership, but they have guest taught a couple of classes both last year and this year. And that has led to more work in terms of a partnership of, unfortunately, it was canceled, but this past spring, every 2 years, the Black Alumni Association here does a Black Alumni Weekend here in Starkville. And that was supposed to be in March. And I was going to be a part of that. University Archives was going to be a part of that. And one of the goals was in talking to the Rashida Forbes, who was the head of the Holmes Center at the time. She's just been promoted to our Associate VP of Diversity Initiatives here. So that's really exciting. But Rashida said that in talking to a lot of older African American alumni, they wanted more of an educational component again at these weekends. And so one of the things we were going to do was a presentation on this kind of stuff and do some mini oral histories, but we didn't get to do that. So there is, I think, room for that and interest there. And, and also in University Archives, we are going to be involved in the kind of university-wide Black history stuff that's happening in the spring. That hasn't always happened. That hasn't always been a collaboration, but the Home Center is fantastic. They're excellent at promoting things, and they are have been really supportive of my class. Yeah, it's not formally a part of our diversity initiatives, but they've been great.
And we are coming up a little past 2 o'clock. It looks like Shauna Collier had a quick question about whether Elder George's first name was Elder, or if that's more of a nickname or a title that's common in churches.
I think it was his name. From the digging around that I've done and what we have on him, and even trying to, I haven't actually found him in Ancestry.com, but as far as I know, that was his name. I haven't seen another name used for him, but yeah, that I wondered that same thing, Shauna.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Jessica, I'm going to thank you again for your time and wonderful presentation. And everybody else, thank you for attending again. Please do stay tuned for our future speakers, and you'll have a chance to rewatch this great presentation as soon as we have it up on our YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thanks,
lovely
everybody. Thank you.